Section 1. The psychological archetype of Capricorn, sternness and triumph through obedience. Certain archetypal images, by virtue of their universal occurrence and enduring power, exert an irresistibly formative influence on the structure of the psyche and, consequently, on the unfolding pageant of history. Among these, the mother, the child, the shadow, the wise old man or woman, the father, or the principle of stern order, stands out with a peculiar majesty. It is this archetype, in its most severe and essential function, that finds its astrological expression in the complex symbol of Capricorn, the sea-goat, whose mythic grounding and psychological lineaments we must scrutinize before we can proceed to the history it presides over. Capricorn, the 10th sign of the zodiac, presents one of the most enigmatic and, at the same time, most concentrated images in the astrological pantheon. The mythic creature is a hybrid, the upper portion of a land-dwelling goat, patient and unwavering in its ascent of the most precipitous heights. The lower, a coiling fish's tail, suggestion of depths and the incalculable wisdom of the sea. This duality is no confusion of opposites, randomly associated, but the natural conjunction of two elemental poles, the earth, sign of material necessity and hard-won achievement, and the water, sign of feeling, memory, and the formless treasury of the unconscious. The oldest images of Capricorn belong to the Sumerian and Egyptian traditions, with the earliest known appearance of the horned, fish-tailed god as the Enki of Eridu, lord not only of the deep, but also the bringer of law and ordered measure. In Babylonian astrology, the sea-goat ruled over waters subterranean and otherwise, and was often associated by a transfer of meaning with the god of death and the ordering of cycles. That the Babylonians, innate masters of measure and number, assigned to Capricorn exactly those qualities we still recognize in its earthly legacy is psychologically no accident, for the underlying law of the symbols is irrepressible, and in such concordance we may descry the true action of archetype through history. But beyond the image stands the myth, and in the myth we may discern the guiding structure of the psyche at work. The goat, in every mythology known to man, is a figure of persistence, obstinacy, cunning, and sometimes sacrificial redemption. To climb the arduous mountain without deflection or descent is not a voluntary act, rather it is the compulsion, even the fate, of that aspect of nature which strives to attain hard-to-reach goals against all obstacles, even at the price of perpetual crisis. This, psychologically, is the stamp not only of the lowly goat, but of every man or woman who, confronted with life's uttermost difficulty, refuses despair and presses upward, one hoofprint at a time, ever higher, nearer to that which may not even be named. The goat's paradoxical tail, the writhing fish body of the depths, is no mere embellishment, but a deliberate indication of the tension between the realm of matter and the treasures of soul buried beneath consciousness. It stands as an emblem of those primordial instincts, feelings, and memories which, though unrecognized by the waking ego, provide the energy and intuition for the successful adaptation of outward striving to the conditions of the world. The goat, if deprived of its watery complement, becomes merely a stubborn ego obsessed with achievement and doomed to self-defeat. Likewise, the fish, unjoined to the body of the goat, flounders aimlessly in the formless void of unconscious impulse. Together, these elements constitute the perfect image of the adaptive psyche as it performs the work of civilization: patient labor, unceasing climb, the deliberate practice of obedience to necessity, and the retrieval from below of those intuitions necessary for true survival and, ultimately, transcendence. Capricorn, therefore, is the sign not of frivolous order or mechanistic law, but of the hardest, most inescapable of all imperatives, the law which, because it is aligned with the structures of nature and the deep unconscious, must be obeyed if the psyche is to escape total dissolution. It is the psychic image, above all, of sternness, rigour, and the wisdom born of suffering. The discipline it enforces is not that of schoolmaster or bureaucrat, but of the elements themselves: wind, stone, sea, cold, heat. Against these there is no negotiation, no compromise, only the patient learning to live on their own unyielding terms. In psychological symbolism, the rule of Saturn governs all that is durable, wise, mortal, and bounded by limitation. Saturn Kronos, the tutelary deity of Capricorn, is not merely the punitive father, but the lord of time, of cycles, and here is the heart of the matter of memory. The ancients, and even we ourselves in more reflective moments, recognize in Saturn not only the fear of judgment, the sense of having been cast out, but also the blessing hidden in every law that is truly attended, a continuity with something greater and more permanent than fleeting egoism. To obey the soul is to come free of the ego's tyranny, and the gift Saturn bestows is the realization that limitation, far from being a curse, is the indispensable precondition to self-reliance and eventual growth. Fate, then, is the Saturnine reality of necessity, yet hidden within it is the inexhaustible grace of the unconscious, that which can be recollected once the shackles of the ego have been softened and broken in the crucible of time. The great mountain climbers of the spirit, the sages, prophets, mystics, reformers, and pioneers of the unknown have all attested to the necessity of enduring long winters of effort, privation, and misunderstanding before the blessing of wisdom is made manifest. The riches they retrieve from the depths, communicated as visions, dreams, and truths hard won, are the treasury of the human race, a treasury stored year after year in the invisible resources of the human collective. It is in this light that we can approach the age of Capricorn, not simply as a chapter in climatology or Paleolithic ethnology, but as a psychic event in the collective unfolding of humanity. For to be cast into an age of extremity and frozen crisis, when the challenge of material survival dominated the waking and dreaming consciousness of the species, is to be thrust willy-nilly into the entire archetypal field, confronted by necessity, limitation, death, but also the opportunity for integration and ascendance that often arises only in the jaws of despair. To borrow from Gothian alchemy, the sapientia Saturnia, or Saturnine wisdom, does not come cheaply. It is the crystallization of experience under pressure, the refinement of discipline in the fire of the impossible, the salt of memory distilled from the tears of the suffering world. Nowhere in the animal kingdom do we find an image so perfectly adaptable, outwardly disciplined, and inwardly responsive as the goat, creature of the uplands and crags, denizen of cold heights, thriving against apparent adversity. That the earliest human survivors, in seeking a means to cognize their experience, seized upon this archetype is to us no surprise. Their intuitions, born from the close confederation of body and soul, ran in advance of later times, when image and symbol would be forced to divide. What appeared then as the simple necessity of living, choosing a cave, building shelter, maintaining fire, hunting, gathering, preserving, entailed, for those who practiced them, a constant adjustment of psychic and material resource. The self-discipline of Saturn reorganized, day by day, into the foundation for knowledge and future achievement. In this crucible, moreover, the youth of the soul is subjected to a kind of tempering rarely, if ever, encountered in times of ease. The child is tested, the family is submitted to stresses unendurable in other epochs. The entire tribe or fledgling society must accommodate itself to the hard wisdom of the leader, or perish. It is at such moments, as every dream analyst knows, that the higher self appears to the struggling ego either as a remorseless judge or as the promise of future reward after adequate labour has been expended. The father, not merely the immediate protector or provider, but the impersonal archetype of order, tradition, and continuity, becomes, in such circumstances, implacable. But the strictures of parenthood are not ends in themselves. They are the indispensable means by which the untried apprentice may become the realized adept. Saturn's law is therefore not merely the curse of fate, but the gateway to freedom. It tests, breaks down, tries, weighs, refines, and eventually certifies. It bestows upon the obedient a future that ignorance and restlessness would have destroyed. It is a fundamental truth, and in no sense peculiar to modernity, that man is what he suffers, and the acts of obedience that are called for in the age of sternness become, in due season, pearls of great price. It is in the passage through shadow, lamentation, and duress that the inner hierarchy of values emerges. Material exigency, cold, want, hunger, death, becomes the crucible in which psychic strength, acquired through contact with the unconscious depths, is rendered into the gold of courage, invention, and enduring patience. And so in the age of Capricorn, the entire human race is, as it were, submitted to a primal ordeal, a dark night of the species' soul. of this ordeal, endured and transcended by a combination of discipline, leadership, method, and the recollection of ancestral memories, leaves its indelible imprint upon the collective unconscious. Here, at the mythic base of all later civilizations, the fundamental psychic template of perseverance under pressure, reverence for wise elders, acceptance of limits, and mastery through self-restraint takes root, a living inheritance that prepares humanity for every future confrontation with the unknown. It is in Saturn's crucible that the capacity for conscious achievement, ambition tempered with the wisdom of suffering, is forged, not merely as a pattern for survival, but as the psychic groundwork for what we recognize in later epochs as civilization itself. Thus, the Capricorn archetype should never be considered simply as a negative constraint or a dour paternal imposition upon reality. Rather, it is the matrix in which the opposites are reconciled: adaptation and tradition, discipline and innovation, the deadly seriousness of material necessity, and the buoyant hope of spiritual insight. In times of peril or stagnation, when the world seems ruled by faceless forces and cruel limitations, the expression of this archetype, patient, cumulative, methodically directed, remains the indispensable precondition for all higher achievement, and the only reliable guide through those regions where mere impulse or youthful bravado would surely fail. Nor is this lesson of Capricorn's symbolism confined to the individual alone. History shows that those societies which most nearly approximate this archetypal model, achieving order through shared sacrifice, honouring the wise, subordinating appetite to long-term planning, and building resilient institutions capable of withstanding cycles of compromise and renewal, are the ones best equipped for continuity and growth. Conversely, civilizations that lose touch with this inner core, squandering discipline in heedless pleasure, or seeking progress without limitation, inevitably suffer the consequences of psychic dissociation and often catastrophic decline. If we are to read the age of Capricorn rightly, then, we must see it as the seedbed of human resilience and as the slow accretion of value through the conscious engagement with adversity. The mountain, symbol of height, clarity, order, and divine communication, cannot be climbed except through the methodical determination represented by our stubborn and aspiring goat. Below the heights, in the tail of the same creature, lie the secret treasures bequeathed to every soul that consents to the heroic discipline of Saturn's law, the wisdom of the depths, the compassion for others similarly beset by hardship, the creative genius that flourishes only through restraint and unremitting practice. The modern psyche, if it is to weather the storms of chaos and be worthy of its own self-appointed mastery, must recover the essential dignities embodied in Capricorn's archetype. For this sign alone, of all the 12, encompasses the totality of the human project, the integration of the spiritual heights and the watery depths, the practice of patience in the face of chaos, the ascendancy of leadership through meritorious struggle, and the enduring victory over crisis through the law of conscious limitation, freely embraced. In this way, by obedience to the soul's deepest imperatives, the path to wholeness is marked out, as surely as the routes of the first explorers crossing frozen Beringia, a path leading from necessity to greatness, from darkness to light. To refuse the tutelage of Capricorn is to repudiate the very ground upon which all further meaning must be constructed. The wise, by contrast, learn to descend before they ascend, to bow before they stand upright, to listen patiently to the memory of the earth and the counsels of the deep. Only then does the mountain open as a temple and the sky reveal the stars as allies of time. For discipline and limitation, rightly held, are the womb of any authentic future. And it is from this crucible, the primordial ordeal of the last glacial maximum, that both the seeds and the promise of the coming ages are born. Section 2. Entering the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum and its challenges. To appreciate the formative impact of the age of Capricorn on the collective psyche, we must begin by imagining, as best we can, the lived realities of the last glacial maximum, LGM. For it was here, amidst the greatest physical challenges anatomically modern Homo sapiens had ever known, that unconscious archetypal motifs, long dormant in the seedbed of the psyche, received their decisive, ruthless confirmation. Time itself, during the LGM, seemed to move not forward but inward, compressing human experience along axes of deprivation and necessity, stripping consciousness to its hardiest essentials, so that only the most resilient patterns, the deepest instincts, could guide the species towards survival and eventual transformation. By empirical reconstruction, the LGM spanned the period from roughly 26,000 to 20,000 years before the present, with its nadir centered around 22,000 to 19,000 BC, precisely the age that, as we have noted, corresponds with the precessional dominion of Capricorn. Global temperatures, at their lowest, stood a remarkable 6 degrees Celsius below present means, and the climate forced ice sheets to extend inexorably from the high latitudes deep into what we now consider temperate zones. Glaciers capped what are today lush mountain valleys. Deserts grew precipitously. In some regions, rainfall dropped by as much as 90%. Some 25% of all land, 4 times more than today, groaned beneath ice, and the sea, frozen into the polar caps and great glaciers of the north, receded by some 125 metres, exposing land bridges and dispersing coastlines far from their contemporary locations. Even these imposing numbers fail to convey the psychological truth of those millennia. Human populations contracted to a few 100,000 souls, scattered across continents partitioned by impassable frontiers of ice, desert, or sea. The Northern Hemisphere, cradle of future civilizations, was itself a divided theatre. In Europe, the Scandinavian and Alpine glaciations pressed relentlessly southward, driving bands of mammoth hunters, reindeer herders, and fishers alike into narrow river valleys or the lee of remnant highlands still free from the white hand of Saturn. Similar stories played out in Siberia and North America, where advancing glaciers dictated not only new paths of migration, but new technologies, social arrangements, and beliefs. Indeed, to follow the trail of the soul through these times is to descend into a world where death stalked every horizon and the resources of life, not only material but psychic, were taxed to their utmost in the daily negotiation with extremity. It is here, in the crucible of the LGM, that we find the deepest confluence between outward event and inward archetypal reality. For if Capricorn, in its mythological aspect, signifies the challenge of survival through discipline, delayed reward, and the construction of authority and ordered tradition, then nowhere in all the prehistoric world did these demands impinge so harshly and so absolutely on the human condition as in the last glacial maximum. Let us reconstruct, piece by piece, the world into which our ancestors descended. At the heart of North America, a vast blankness lay, an ice sheet, rivaling the South Polar Cap in thickness and expanse, smothered the land from present-day New England westward and north to Alaska, eastward to the Labrador Sea, rising in some places 2 kilometers above the earth. Only the intermittent, narrow coastal corridors, like fragile arteries, enabled mammal and man alike to course southward, provided that sea, ice, and storm relented enough to offer passage. In Eastern and Central Europe, another ice mass of equally incomprehensible scale pressed south, walling off uplands and confining game and men to river terraces in the shadows or to the sheltered periphery of the glacial front. Archaeology confirms the concentration of population in these spots. Thin bands along the Garonne, Dordogne, Saône, Danube, Dniester, and Volga rivers. Hunting and settlement activity shows remarkable regularity on the 200-meter terraces above the floodplains, confirming what our psychological intuition would guess, that crisis produces not chaos, but a relentless, unimaginative conservatism. The psychic labour here was not innovation alone, but the endless, knee-deep trudge of tradition, the performance of time-tested strategies, the ceaseless recurrence of routine, the measured obedience of the whole to the conclusions of the experienced wise. Yet where necessity breeds invention, Psyche answers with new form. In the old world, the limits imposed by ice and scarcity drove the perfection of portable skin tents, bone and antler tools, and the further elaboration of projectile weaponry. In these transformations we detect not only the adaptation of life to environmental insult, but the increasingly conscious reflection upon the meaning of objects, the investment of psychic energy into systems of pattern, memory, and law. We see this in the sudden proliferation of carved and painted artifacts, the systematic ordering of campsites, the revision of burial practices, a growing need to remember, to teach, to link the generations by something more substantial than mere hunger or mutual need. The evidence grows even more striking when we turn to the territories of Beringia, that vast, now submerged corridor linking Asia and North America. 1,000 kilometers in width at its greatest extent, larger than all of present-day Alaska, Beringia for millennia functioned as both homeland and crucible for Paleolithic populations hailing from the Siberian north. Genetic research suggests that a band of perhaps 500 to 1,000 individuals carrying the mitochondrial legacy of both Asian and Western lineages crossed from the Kolyma or Lena river valleys into this refugium around the apex of the LGM, only to remain isolated there for many hundreds or even several thousand years. This so-called Beringian standstill is among the most remarkable phenomena of the LGM. It testifies to the constraints, both environmental and psychological, that forced new adaptations, but also permitted the consolidation of archetypal patterns. The descendants of this group in time would seed the future inhabitants of both North and South America, making Beringia not just a pathway, but a crucible, a Capricornian mountain island fixed in the midst of an ocean of ice, demanding from its inhabitants the full range of discipline, memory, long-term strategic vision, and the obedience of the present to the unwritten laws of a probable but never certain future. It is no historical accident, therefore, that the great migratory push southward into the Americas occurred at just this moment, during the greatest climatic adversity known to man. Step by step, by the power of slow strategic advance, the patient accumulation of communal wisdom, and the daily performance of survival routines honed over generations, small bands of explorers pressed into the unknown, marking the beginnings of that process that would eventually see mankind populate in detail the entire breadth of North and South America. The granularity of their success, their minute-to-minute, day-by-day achievement of life in the teeth of the storm, is nothing less than the archetypal realization of what we know as Capricorn's discipline and labour. Nor does the New World story stand in isolation. Parallel developments underscore the universality of this Saturnine crucible. In northern China, archaeological data points to a disturbing gap between 34,000 and 9,000 years ago, a hiatus in population and culture so great as to suggest near-total depopulation, treeless steppes, permafrost, and immense deserts, combined with the disappearance of variability in the fossil record of Homo sapiens, reconfirm the planetary scope of the LGM's pressure. In southern China, resilient populations clung to life in refugia, developing technologies of storage, textile and food acquisition, chopsticks, fishing and traps that seem retroactively the very incarnations of collective discipline, method and possessiveness that astrologers attribute to the sign of the goat. In Australia, the story, though less dramatic in terms of population bottlenecks, offers a different witness to Capricorn's archetypal severity. Despite a relatively continuous record of occupation, the inland Aboriginal cultures were hard-pressed by the changing climate, enduring aridity and extinction of large mammals, but persisting through a rigorous adaptation to seasonal cycles. The improvement of fire management and the reinforcement of spiritual customs binding the peoples ever more tightly to the law, that invisible but implacable network of beliefs and taboos, without which survival on such a scale would be literally unthinkable. Africa, too, saw its own crisis. The deserts of the Sahara, Gobi and Kalahari expanded. The humid climate upon which the balance of savanna and forest depend became subject to violent fluctuations, and human groups pressed inward from the periphery by aridity, contracted into ever smaller and more conflict-ridden enclaves. The Ishango bone, unearthed in present-day Congo and dated to 20,000 years ago, carries evidence of the world's oldest calendar or mathematical device, hinting at the emergence of conscious timekeeping, a Saturnine virtue par excellence. But already, beneath the surface of paleoanthropological detail, the deeper script is being written. The birth of the archetypal pattern of authority, the emergence of structures both internal and external, capable of holding psychic and social tension not for years, but for centuries and millennia at a stretch. The Neolithic revolution of the mind, which alone made the later Neolithic revolution of culture and material production possible, is taking shape under the snows. It is a seed planted by invisible hands, unconscious of its own purposes, watered by the tears shed on the frozen horizon. For the archetype does not manifest as conscious intention, rather it appears at first as compulsion, as a felt necessity, or as an invisible wall of fate wherever survival is challenged and routine no longer suffices. Such necessity burns away the dross of the accidental, compelling the psyche to organize itself around those configurations. Coordination, memory, tradition, careful timing, that alone make long-term endurance possible. In striving to preserve the lives of its members, the group inadvertently serves a deeper master, the archetype of ordered authority and pragmatic wisdom that transforms a shifting collection of individuals into an organized society. Now we see that the challenges of the last glacial maximum required not only brute physical endurance, but the conscious and unconscious coordination of resources, the preservation and transmission of knowledge, and the selection of leadership capable of synthesizing experience into reliable rules. It is in such context that we notice the first systematic burial of the dead, the maintenance of sacred sites, the building of communal dwellings, and the use of symbols to fix memory and communicate practices across generations. These are the signatures both of increasing ego strength and of the maturing influence of the wise old man or woman. The archetype, who contains the experience of the group, mediates between past and future, and whose authority is derived equally from insight and from empathetic oversight. The psychological significance of this is considerable. In consultation rooms today, we recognize these same pressures in the dreams of individuals facing chronic illness, social marginalization, or liminal passages in life. Those threshold crises where the soul can no longer rely on old patterns and is forced to venture, step by step, through the unknown. The patient's distress over grinding repetition, the compulsion to conserve, the preoccupation with wasting time, and the search for mentors are not merely symptoms of modern neurosis, but echoes, at a smaller scale, of humanity's earliest march through the ice. It is in such prolonged hardship that the sense of time is carved most forcibly into the psyche. Saturn was not, in earliest myth, an enemy of humankind. Rather, he was entrusted with their nurture, and it was only after he grew devouring and arbitrary that he was cast down. In this myth, we see dramatized the psychological tension between wise use of limitation and the inflation of ego-based control. Under the rule of necessity, the group learns the value of periodic rest, of synchronizing effort with natural cycles, of adapting to the shifting winds of fortune. The wise leader becomes one who reads not only the signs in the sky, but the signs in the hearts of his or her followers, a capacity founded not on personal brilliance, but on humility, patience, and the willingness to endure in solitude what must later be communicated for the welfare of all. Such virtues arise not from luxury, but from hardship. And as we can infer from the LGM record, human societies did not simply hunker down into stasis, but responded dynamically within the limits of their circumstances. Innovations erupted in food preservation, clothing manufacture, projectile technology, hunting methods, and communal architecture, not as linear progress, but as the scattered, fortuitous eruptions of genius made possible by the disciplined preservation and cooperative cross-fertilization of knowledge. We would be mistaken, however, to imagine this time as one of only suffering, loss, and trepidation. For wherever the boundaries were strictest, wherever the unknown pressed most insistently against the known, the value of the individual and the discovery of the transcendent began to grow. In the LGM, we see the first widespread evidence of sculpture, painting, and the symbolic representation of the divine. These artifacts are not idle decorations. They serve as the deposit and vehicle for meaning, the repositories of accumulated suffering and wisdom, giving voice and form to the growing sense that human life, however miserable, persists within a cosmos not of its absolute making. Here, the embryonic structures of ritual and religion begin to congeal. Seasonal rounds are not merely the traversal of necessary tasks, but become opportunities for the collective psyche to recalibrate and reinvigorate itself. Cycles of feasting and fasting, of ritual burial and commemoration, of initiation and ordeal, bind the living to the dead, and the now to the once and future. Even the heavens, now observed under glacial clarity for months on end, take on new significance as timekeepers, as markers of destiny, as the unwitting stage for stories and portents that shape group identity and narrate in mythic form the archetypal drama being enacted beneath the sun and stars. Thus, the last glacial maximum was not only the crucible of material resilience, but the birthplace of those aspects of the psyche that later generations would call conscience, memory, duty, and piety. At the very nadir of physical suffering, collective life acquired a new axis, the vertical, the transcendent, the rising line connecting earth to heaven, daily labour to eternal order. No wonder then that in later times this epoch would be remembered not only or even primarily for its suffering, but for its silent gift, the turning of mere necessity into freely chosen virtue, of limitation into the matrix of enduring meaning. And so, to return to the arc of history and the process of individuation alike, we recognise in the age of Capricorn under the LGM not a simple calamity or a holding action, but a crucible for the transformation of the human soul. It is here, in the dark depths of climate and history, that Psyche became conscious of limitation and so gained the foothold necessary for all subsequent ascent. For without patience, obedience to reality, and the humility to accept help from the living and the dead alike, no growth is possible, neither for the species nor for the individual. The slow, bitter accomplishment of those centuries became, in the fullness of time, the silent foundation for every cathedral, every system of law, every artistic and religious flowering, and every moment of genuine self-knowledge that would one day emerge from the human journey through the stars. Section 3, the Capricorn Initiative, the invention of authority and strategic planning. When I consider the shapes of authority that crystallized in the psychic landscape of the last glacial maximum, I can discern the outlines of what may aptly be called the primordial father archetype, not the individualized personal father of the familial drama alone, but the numinous ancestor of order, whose stern guidance enables the living community to adapt to crisis and channel its energies toward unforeseeable future goals. This archetype, saturnine, remote, grave, and yet unfailingly pragmatic, emerges ever more clearly from the study of Paleolithic social structures, where leadership, memory, and adaptation converge in a psychological pattern as necessary to tribal survival as bones are to flesh. Let us be precise. The environmental duress of the age of Capricorn, exemplified by the glacial gauntlet and perilous resource scarcities, did not simply produce authority, as a sculptor might produce a statue from yielding clay. Rather, adversity forced the rising forth, the constellating, of those latent psychic factors by which the group could ensure its survival. These factors include, but are not limited to, respect for experience and memory, the ritualization of decision-making, the codification of knowledge into rules, the preservation of history and invention, the recognition of limitation, and the strategic projection of present action onto future contingencies through conscious planning. In the earliest periods, what we know of leadership and coordinated action is necessarily fragmentary. Archaeological excavations provide neither the written records of lawgivers nor the explicit iconographies of god-kings. Their evidence is indirect, inferred from the bones of the dead, the layout of settlements, and the organisation of toolkits and debris. Yet it is precisely these indirect signs that speak loudest to the trained psychological observer. For psychic aptation, being an unwilled response to necessity, is always legible, if not through culture, then through the immutable archetypes that organise group life. In Sungir, the oldest richly furnished burial site known to us, dated nearly 24,000 years before the present. The twin graves of children bedecked with thousands of painstakingly fashioned and ordered ornaments reveal not only a high degree of technological sophistication, but the presence of hierarchy, status differentiation, and, from a symbolic vantage, the willingness of the group to invest its survival capital, time, skill, resources, in marking psychic importance that outlives the flesh. The consistent orientation of graves, the presence of carefully chosen grave goods, and the selection of burial sites amidst living spaces all point to a society ruled not merely by law of the strongest, but by acknowledgement of traditions and functions extending beyond the ego's immediate horizon. Behind every such social fact stands an emergent authority structure. We see this, for example, in the design of base camps and the specialization of tools assigned to different regions of terrain, river valleys, upland steppes, forested margins, signifying a division of labour, strategic use of resources, and reliance on concentrated transferable knowledge in the hands of a minority. The first kings, queens, shamans, elders, or whoever it was that embodied the archetype of knowing restraint and initiative in the teeth of disaster. The co-occurrence of similar technological sequences, parallel development of projectile points, complex bone harpoons, tailored clothing across widely separated regions is not proof of accidental duplication, but the stamp of an archetype at work, the underlying logic of strategic adaptation, Capricorn's method, clothed in the particulars of geography and necessity. Nor is this archetype confined to the circuitry of technology. In the Paleolithic temples of bone and tusk, Mezhirich, the Ukrainian sites, we find conclusive evidence of deliberate engineering and recurrent planning, marking the transformation of the haphazard fireside into the planned ritual space. These structures are not only homes but archives of memory, the permanent addresses for the imagination. Their forms, repeated season after season, encode the hidden knowledge of cycles: spring, summer, autumn, death, migration, reproduction, harvest, and the like, whose reliable repetition stands as the first law of any effective authority. It is here in the repetition and deliberate deployment of strategic planning that we glimpse the seeds of law, the minute beginnings of conscious structure in psyche and system alike. The law, as an archetype, is what serves to bring order to contingency. It subordinates the immediate to the general, the present to the future, the transient to the permanent. In earliest societies, it appears not yet as the explicit lex terrana of monarch or assembly, but as the hidden protocol of the group, the rules by which collective action is synchronized, memories are shared, tasks are assigned, and conflict is resolved. These first laws are not less real for being unstated. On the contrary, they function with greater force precisely because they are implemented not by external compulsion, but by living and often unconscious consensus. The cognitive revolution required for such structure is immense. It is the passage from a world ruled by instinct and spontaneous adaptation to one regulated through self-reflexive planning, what in the New Testament is signified by the shift from the promise of the patriarchs to the Mosaic covenant, the 10 words written in stone. The law is externalized conscience, not only the supervening judgment of father or shaman, but the slow, deliberate marshalling of the collective's intelligence and feeling into a hierarchically managed system. Saturn, in this dimension, is both the father and the son. Tradition and innovation combine to produce process and outcome at the necessary time, to kairos in oikeio, the due order of things. Within these patterns, we see the psychological birth of the social contract. Survival in the LGM was not guaranteed by genius, courage, or luck alone, but by the inescapable need to sacrifice immediacy for the sake of duration. The classic Capricorn virtues, duty, deferral of gratification, realism, acknowledgement of suffering, careful planning, and the ability to recall the remote past and anticipate the distant future, emerged not as supererogation but as currency more valuable than bone, skin, or flint. In this sense, the politics of every Paleolithic tribe was an economics of time, as subtle and as difficult to evaluate as any present-day system of monetary exchange. An illuminating corollary of this insight is the role that ritual and myth played in buttressing authority. For it is not an accident but a psychological consequence that the sites of densest occupation and greatest hardship produce the densest networks of symbol, story, and metaphysical speculation. Ritual, we recall, is the depotentiation of destructive anxiety and the recalibration of the group's psychic economy by collective performance. In the age of Capricorn, every such, however primitive, operated as a tool of maintenance and as a system for updating and enforcing rules. The first hunt, the winter sacrifice, the ritual exile of the dead, the naming of elders, each spoke in the language of myth, but secured real and lasting gains by channeling emotion into system, story into law, and anxiety into ordered acceptance. This is why, in the art of the caves, Altamira, Kosker, Chauvet, and many others, we find not only the testimony to early visual genius, but more profoundly, the inscription of law upon the walls of the group's soul. Such art is neither decorative nor documentary. It is an explicit act of memory and intention, an altar before which the present and the absent, the living and the dead, the known and the unknown, meet in acts of shared recognition. The symbolism of the painted bison, horse, aurochs, or salmon speaks not merely to the abundance of sustenance or the wonder of animal kinship, but to the periodic renewal of cosmic law through the repetition of ritual, the redrawing of the limits of world and psyche alike, and the submission of the group to the authority validated by existence itself. From this well of order, the psyche drinks deeply. For it is precisely at such moments where group and individual are aligned, where inner and outer necessity are recognized as one, that the numinous potency of archetype is felt with greatest force. The individual, no longer just a collection of needs and impulses, becomes both preserver and innovator, participant in the ordered unfolding of cycles, and in the deepest sense, a carrier of destiny writ large, not as mere fate, but as the collective telos of the species in its labour to survive, reproduce, and press a little farther into the unknown. Historically, we might say the invention of authority was the first social technology, and strategic planning the first science. Yet to see them in dualistic fashion is to miss their deep interdependence. Just as planning requires social memory and shared insight, so authority is grown in every society from the secret recognition of wisdom, the permission to invest obedience in one whose judgments, however chastening, are justified by results. Capricorn, in this sense, is not the despot but the true king, Plato's imagined philosopher king and the Old Testament's wise judge, who unites the virtues of endurance and munificence, past wisdom joined with future vision. It follows, then, that every true innovation is in some sense a retrieval of what has gone before, a return of the repressed, not as neurotic repetition but as alchemical transformation. The LGM, for all its severity, was the womb of everything that followed, and its Capricornian signature, the invention and perfection of authority and the slow collective mastery of strategic planning, is encrypted in every subsequent development of polity, society, and faith. From the earliest stone circles to the rights of kings, from the earliest accumulation of surplus food to the contemporary spreadsheet, from the role of the shaman elder to the laws of the modern city, the pattern inscribed is the same, an archetypal logic of limitation, obedience, aspiration, and renewal, finding its outward form according to the pressures and opportunities of each age. But we must not make the error, so common in our time, of severing psyche from history, or of viewing these deep etchings of authority and strategy as mere scaffoldings for neurosis, to be overthrown or discarded. Such a perspective reflects only the shallowest understanding of archetypal necessity. After all, every advance confers a shadow, every order a propensity for rigidity, every law the temptation of tyranny, every system the inertia of mindless repetition. Yet to decry these as accidents of socio-historical contingency is to disregard the far more primary fact that without authority and the temporal knowledge of consequences, there could be no progress whatsoever, no unfolding of civilization, no cultivation of character, nor any reliable transmission of what is truly wise across the generations. That the age of Capricorn gave shape to these formative psychic patterns underlines humanity's capacity for conscious agency in the midst of overwhelming odds. What appears from a distance as necessity or natural selection is, on closer descriptive study, the slow, ambiguous but undeniable advance of insight, wrenched from hardship by those who dared not only to remember but to transform by will and imagination the inheritance of pain into the birthright of new generations. In the Capricornian crucible, suffering was the tuition for wisdom, and the deferred rewards of strategy found their fulfillment not only in survival, but in the opening of new paths for the soul's ambitious upward climb. As the centuries passed and the ice receded, the lesson of this archetype was reinforced, not erased. The world to come, with its prophets, lawgivers, kings, sages, and system smiths, was nourished at the breast of hardship and order. Our modern world, forgetful of this lineage, risks the shadow of neurotic rebellion, a collective adolescence that refuses discipline, derides tradition, and mistakes egoic cleverness for enduring authority. In our time, perhaps more than at any since the LGM, the fruits of strategic mastery and the necessity of wise leadership are again in need of radical recollection. If my intuition proves correct, and the psychological inheritance of the last glacial maximum persists in our modern neuroses and aspirations, then it behooves us to relearn the basic grammar first spoken in that distant age. The invention of authority was, in truth, the invention of conscious life lived beyond the immediate present. Its genius was not to enslave, but to free. For in the shared pattern of obedience to reality, the group transcended the limits of fear and appetite, became coherent, and made possible the slow, arduous awakening of the inward law by which we still, if only dimly, calibrate our highest hopes and our most enduring works. And of the smith-forging spear and plough, everything that raises up the hard-won fruits of the Capricornian period evokes the same rune, the psycho-cosmological grammar. There is law, there is memory, there is mastery, there is a reason to strive, suffer, endure, and ascend. We would do well, then, to regard every age's authority dilemma as a sacred opportunity for remembering. The role of Saturn and of the archetypal father is not simply to punish or delay, but to foster resilience, evoke planning, confer discipline, and, when the fullness of time has come, to grant the release that is both freedom and fulfillment. The Capricornian initiation, written into the bones of our ancestors, is also the hidden pulse beneath every modern act of true authority, every skillful compromise and every completed labour of meaning, an origin we never exhaust, a treasure we can spend, wisely or unwisely, until the end of time. Section 4, Material Mastery, the Capricorn Conquest of the Earth Element. The history of the last glacial maximum, as we have examined, is one of hardship resolved by collective discipline, leadership, and the inexorable surfacing of those archetypes needed to secure continuance amidst crisis. Yet there is a further dimension, whose significance must not be minimized: the mastery of matter, that home ground of the Capricornian archetype, what I would call the conjunction of ego and earth. Here, in the most literal sense, the drama of survival was also a drama of spiritual and psychological individuation. The late Paleolithic does not merely preside over the multiplication of useful tools. It inaugurates a systematic dialogue between mind and world, spirit and substance, in which every human act, if rightly scrutinized, becomes a footnote in the unwritten scriptures of the psyche's formation. That the material achievements of this age required the full measure of the goat's discipline is obvious at a glance. Dwellings, stitched clothing, permanent hearths, projectile weaponry, none emerged ex nihilo, but evolved through the ceaseless winnowing of trial by ordeal, invention in the face of deprivation, precision born from the harshest requirements of nutrition and warmth. Mezhirich, aforementioned site in the Dnieper basin, stands as a monument to precisely such a conjunction. A circle 30 to 40 feet in diameter, constructed entirely from the bones of 60 mammoths. Here, in frozen time, we see that what Capricorn demands, order out of chaos, endurance through patience, the steady accumulation of structure where Mother Nature no longer supplies, was achieved not by whimsical impulse, but by long-fostered directed labour. The construction of such dwellings was no trivial act, nor was it possible absent the coordinated efforts of expert teams, shared plans, and remembered lessons handed down through generations. The extraction, transport, selection, and assembly of the necessary materials required planning over distances of many kilometres, intergroup cooperation, and, above all, a shared psychic attitude toward the ends to be achieved. The house in this prehistorical setting was not a personal retreat or mere shelter from the elements. It was a symbolic structure demarcating a zone of order, persistence, and psychic embodiment in the midst of hostile entropy. A parallel story unfolds in the realm of ceramic production. The origins of ceramic technology, which the complacency of moderns would assign to primitive necessity, are instead the result of precisely those initiatory sufferings and yearnings that Capricorn synthesizes into eventual mastery of the earth element. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech lands, more than 27,000 years ago, small statues of animals, deities, and abstract forms were shaped from a mixture of less and water, then fired to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The logic of such firing, with its requirement for coeval mastery of fire, careful construction of kilns, and the dogged repetition of minute improvements, is unambiguously Capricornian. not an art of immediacy or improvisation, but the patient setting of hands to work, learning from successive cycles of pleasure and destruction, hope and collapse. The Paleolithic art of bone and antler working joins this chorus. Tools, combs, harpoons, delicate needles for threading sinew and sinews for sewing cloaks. The domestication of objects wrought from the dead, remains of mammal and fish. Here again, the discipline needed to achieve such mastery was no self-serving economy. It was the accumulation of collective experience and memory transformed into usable technology, deferrable skill, transferable meaning, and stored surplus of both material and psychic energy. We may argue then that the organisation of matter in this period was never mere technique. It was the supreme effort by which conscious life pressed into solidity the necessary conditions for the birth of future civilization. The careful ordering of tasks, the establishment of dedicated storage spaces, and the formalized routines of construction and maintenance all symbolized the union of memory, will, and the recognition of necessity. In all of this, one perceives not the automatic working of instinct, but a nascent intentionality, an activation of ego by archetypal necessity that transcended the immediate and survived long enough to be memorialized in the enduring forms of culture. It is no mystery, then, that the first calendars emerge from the same substrate. The Ishango bone, with its carefully incised notches, is not merely an inventory or a record of transactions. It is a testimony to the psychic drive towards systematic timekeeping, forecasting, and the anticipation of lunar and seasonal cycles. In the north, as at mid-latitudes and in the antipodes, the construction of standardized month or year-length records, crucial for hunting, fishing, and migration, reflects the mental fusion of material mastery and the higher principle of lasting order. Closely paralleling these outward advances is the flowering of internal spiritual symbolic labour. The caves, from Altamira to Cosquer, are repositories not only of artistic genius but of psychic transmutation. In the dim, echoing halls of Earth's belly, the first codings of law and order descended from heaven to dwell among mortals. Paintings and engravings of prey animals, shamans, celebrations of fertility and death, all constructed with deliberate purpose, using tools and pigments carefully prepared over seasons and generations. The effort required to traverse, illuminate, and ornament these labyrinthine spaces spoke to a seriousness of purpose that can be termed religious only in its utmost sense. A commitment to collective focus, the preservation and transmission of knowledge, and the gradual forging of an inside order distinct from the chaos of the outside. The layered symbolism of these works, bone, pigment, stone, fire, smoke, speaks to a mode of consciousness that single-handedly synthesized vision and will, matter and spirit, sentiment and law. In mastering the earth element, our ancestors did not invent new skills in the narrow sense, but rather remembered forward, reading from the exigencies of crisis the patterns of order needed for long-term flourishing. Capricorn, in alchemical language, is the nigredo, the blackening that must submit to the fire, transmuting chaos into form before the conjunctio, the sacred wedding of opposites, can bestow the gold. But the shadow side of earth mastery is always present. As structure accumulates, so does the potential for rigidity, repetition, and repression. The discipline demanded by technology and art can become, when uncoupled from living need and meaning, the compulsions of obsession. The fossilization of dead law, Capricorn's shadow, tyranny, emptiness, repetition for its own sake. Yet in the context of the LGM, with its relentless environmental pressures, the creation of structure was a living necessity. Every advance in material mastery also occasioned a further integration of the ego and its shadow, an opportunity to acknowledge the limits of invention and accept the reality of loss. The ultimate fruit of this engagement was the externalization of the psyche's structure in what would become civilization. The domestication of animals for all its cruelty and cost, the cultivation of plants with its attendant disciplines of planting, weeding and harvesting, the manipulation of metals and minerals with their spiritual overtones, the formulation of sacred law with its appeal to permanence, all arose from the heart of the Capricornian project, a labour not only of hand but also of imagination, foresight, memory and deep feeling. It would be wrong, however, to romanticize the goals or to ignore the cost. Where material mastery grows, so too does hubris. The castles of the ego built on the rock of wisdom are always threatened by the return of what is cast out, the repressed, the forgotten, the unsymbolized. Capricorn's teachings, seen in serial epochs, offer us a warning as well as a map that every hierarchy, however necessary, must submit to periodic renewal and be balanced by a living awareness of the whole. The archetype of Earth, if mistaken for stasis, generates not wisdom but neurosis, not law but violence, not order but slavery. Nevertheless, the psychological gains of the LGM and the Capricornian ascendancy remain the inheritance of modern humanity. In our capacity for reflective world-making, in the myths with which we interpret disaster, in the slow cumulative labour of science and art, and in the routines of law and discipline that undergird every leap for freedom, we are simultaneously using and being used by patterns learned from the Earth itself, from cold stone, vanishing game, and the incremental progress from necessity to meaning. Perhaps this is why, in times of chaos, we are drawn again and again to the surety and solidity of the mountain, the goat's ascensional logic. We seek to renew our contact with those fixed points, real or symbolic, that anchor the self amidst multiple flux, to replicate within our own souls the structure of the world as it is found in matter. Mastery of the earth element, then, is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing negotiation. It requires humility, discipline, and a willingness to submit the ego's designs to the hard lessons learned by our ancestors, whose survival required the fusion of hand, eye, and mind under Capricorn's stern tutelage. The fruits of such mastery are not to be measured by immediate outcome, but by the durability of meaning and the transmission of psychic integrity across generations. And this, ultimately, is the work of civilization. Not the abolishing of necessity, but the transmutation of constraint into freedom, the conversion of suffering into wisdom, the knitting together of personal and collective adversity into a fabric of value that can endure change and be passed on, even unto the end of time or the next ice age, should that be mankind's fate. Section 5. The Capricornian Psyche. Meaning-making under extreme pressure. It is a universally observed truth, borne out in the consulting room as much as in the record of prehistory, that the highest psychic meaning, the transformation of suffering into value, emerges not from the avoidance of hardship, but from a courageous confrontation with necessity. In the age of Capricorn and under the shadow of the last glacial maximum, this principle found unrelenting confirmation. The shaping of the Paleolithic mind and the evolution of human consciousness was neither a process of smooth expansion nor a pain to untrammeled instinct, but the step-by-step forging of meaning through the crucible of deprivation, loss, and the faithful attention to what, at first, appears solely as the intractable judgment of fate. The lives of our ancestors, reduced to a bare minimum by population contraction, buffeted by cycles of ice and aridity dependent on razor-thin margins of subsistence, offered little in the way of material security. Yet, paradoxically, it was in such conditions that the collective psyche rose to new heights of self-consciousness, record-making, symbolic imagination and spiritual vision that could neither have appeared nor been sustained in times of unbroken prosperity. Out of the saturnine milieu of bitter necessity were distilled the gold and frankincense of meaning, the spiritual compensations, the symbolic technologies, and the social and religious structures that still animate our world. This is most dramatically illustrated by the evidence of Paleolithic symbolic behaviour, the grand caves and smaller shrines, the deliberate formation of iconographies, and the formalisation of ritual art, whose function was not merely to record reality, but to remake, redirect, and reconceive it within the living psyche. It is surely no coincidence that in times of greatest environmental pressure, the investment in symbolic work increases. Art becomes not a luxury, but a necessity. Ritual, not an afterthought to the day's toil, but the supreme occasion for linking suffering to hope, impermanence to aspiration, the cold periphery of time to the radiating warmth of the eternal now. Where a contemporary observer, bereft of myth, sees only struggle and deprivation, the religious imagination perceives the operation of an archetypal principle, the mysterium conjunctionis, the union of opposites in the fire of ordeal. The hand stencils of Cosca and Gargas, the spray paintings of narrow caves made from pigment spit or blown through hollow reeds, The repeated animal images at Chauvet Lascaux Altmira Cueva del Castillo, the polychrome bison and horses layered atop older etchings. Each of these marks is more than a record of passing interest. They are what we might call depth symbols, crystalline forms framing the otherwise invisible story of psychic development. In his struggle for survival, the Paleolithic artist-worshipper conjoined intention and intuition, memory and improvisation. He or she painted not only for themselves, their band or their immediate tribe, but for all time across the thresholds dividing existence into sacred and profane. This is the essence of archetypal meaning-making. To create out of enslavement to necessity, the first glimmering of mastery over circumstance. The very process of drawing or etching, the deliberate building up of symbol through calculated addition, is the psychic rehearsal of the spiritual labour at the heart of individuation. In inscribing their meanings on the cave walls, our ancestors fashioned in material the structures they needed inwardly to withstand the splitting of time and death. If the world outside ordained suffering and change, the world inside the cave became a matrix of order, the other womb, in which psychospiritual resilience was gestated and the future of the human mind made possible. There are deeper layers still. The superimposition of pigment, the retouching and revision of scenes, the modulation of iconography, and the eventual introduction of formal abstraction, cross-hatching, checkerboards, spirals and meanders are not mere stylistic developments, but index the awakening of metacognition, the capacity for doubling back, for relating the present awareness to a remembered or anticipated event in the psychic field. In case after case, we observe new images rising over, and at times erasing, earlier motifs, as if the community of cultures was ceaselessly revising the indices of time and meaning to keep pace with the transformation or dissolution of the outward world. No less than the overwriting of a manuscript, these palimpsests mark the consciousness of a future that is always refigurable, anchored in the permanent yet never resigned to repetition without change. One is reminded, inevitably, of the ongoing labour of psychotherapy. In the analytic dialogue, the patient's narrative is repeatedly revised, reformed, and recharged with energy as new insight displaces old habit and as premature fatalisms are reinterpreted as unfinished patterns of transformation. The same could be said of the recursive structure of myth, in which compression, loss, or contradiction never results in abandonment, but rather in adaptation, revision, and the renewal of a narrative interrupted. The soul, compelled by its own necessity, cannot rest until it has constructed a meaning equal to the weight of its suffering, and will seize on any symbolic structure, however rudimentary, that offers to hold this tension within the bounds of what is consciously bearable. The calendar is perhaps the greatest achievement of these hard times. Ishango and Lubombo Bone's lunar and solar reckonings, stone rings carefully aligned with solstice or equinoxal markers, all these attest to the psychic imperative to reckon with the cycles of time, to bind the randomness of nature to a narrative of return and renewal. The annual round, the seasonal journey of the sun through sky and zodiac, the lunar months and the intercalations, all were reifications of Saturn's temporal law, encoded in symbol and ritual by the work of many centuries. The intention was never to control the world, but to attune the rhythms of the body and the society to the implacable yet ultimately meaningful cycles of necessity. The archetype of Kronos, time as both terror and redeemer, found its home in the mind and heart of Paleolithic man through the daily practice of order, discipline, and the remembrance of essential knowledge. When the need for meaning is starved, the result is not simple deprivation, but the pathological proliferation of counterfeits. The rigid ceremonies of the dying cultures, the compulsive ritualization of behavior, and the desperate salvage of symbols made obsolete by shifting climate or population are all signs that reveal by their excess the centrality of the work of conscience, the construction and revision of meaning by which societies as well as individuals remain whole. It follows, then, that the mastery of time and substance achieved by the age of Capricorn was predicated on a relentless effort to attend to the meaning of the present in the context of the whole. Every mammoth bone dwelling, every layer of pigment on an aged cave wall, every systematic burial, often with ochre, or possessions meant for a life beyond. Every cycle of festival, fasting, or migration, each stands as proof of the triumph of meaning over meaninglessness, of spirit over mere necessity. The big picture of the glacial psychology is, therefore, the story of the integration of the shadow, the abject violence of the environment, the recurrence of famine, the struggle to find and maintain refugia, all are underpinned by a self-disclosure of the latent evil in nature, what the Gnostics would later name the envious gods or archons, that dwell not only in the heavens but in the hidden places of Psyche. The shadow integration demanded by this time frame did not come as a one-time accomplishment, but as the gradual internalization of those energies which the external environment mirrored and amplified without mercy. If the archetypes are, as I have come to believe, rooted in timeless truth, then it is in the adversity of the LGM that we see the earliest, most unambiguous confirmation of this maxim. A striking parallel can be found in the myth of Saturn devouring his children, a theme found in the cave paintings as well as the later iconographies of the West. The image at Chauvet, where the outlines of predator and prey are superimposed until they become a swirling unity, is not a documentary record of ancient animals, but a meta-symbol, an expression of the awareness that order devours its own children, that structure is built on the death of antecedents, and that the price of endurance is a continual sacrifice of the fleeting for the sake of the enduring. In the paradoxical act of painting, destroying and painting again, the artists and their communities link the fate of each individual with the destiny of the whole, so that every loss contains, as seed and leaven, the promise and possibility of transformation. It is instructive, too, to reflect on the spiritual ramifications of Paleolithic astronomy. The tracking of lunar, solar and stellar cycles was intimately connected to the labour of the shamanic priesthoods, whose role was not only to interpret the vicissitudes of nature, but to connect the shifting seasons with the temporal hierarchies prescribing action, taboo and renewal. The journey of the shaman into the depths of the underworld, whether accompanied by drugs, fasting or ordeal, was itself an echoed image of the group's passage through deprivation, a triumph over disintegration by the conscious recapitulation of death, followed by return with new knowledge. These rites of integration, whose detail and grandeur is only now becoming palatable to modern psychological research, represent the labour by which the extremes of crisis were consciously endured and then symbolically overcome. The emergent voice of the father, reed, call it lawgiver, shaman, or primordial sage, became, in these times, the axis around which psychic meaning was both stabilised and transmitted. Where the archetypal father became internalized as the wise authority and mediator of the group's collective memory, the result was continuity and fruitful adaptation. Where that archetype ossified into the capricious patriarch or tyrant, the shadow of Saturn emerged as cruelty, absurd ritual, and catastrophic collapse. In both cases, however, the psychological pattern that persisted was one of obedience, either to a living, evolving inner law that permitted renewal and innovation, or to a dead letter, compulsively forced but cut off from the true needs of life. Thus, the ultimate meaning-making accomplishment of the Capricornian psyche was its ability to carry the weight of contradiction without deadly fragmentation. Hardship, the demand for discipline, the periodic need for ruthless action, none of these destroyed the soul of Paleolithic society. Instead, through ritual, symbol, and the creation of collective memory, each crisis became an opportunity for deepening the integration of opposites. Ego with shadow, law with innovation, spirit with matter, life with death. The best evidence for this remains not in artifacts or bones, but within the human psyche itself, in the archetypal repertoires of meaning to which every individual in times of crisis still turns for guidance, renewal, and hope. If it is the task of the modern psychologist to bear witness to the enduring deposits of the unconscious, let us then acknowledge that the crises of the past are still alive in us, not as raw suffering, but as the source of memory, character, discipline, and the moral law. The Capricornian legacy, forged in the last ice age, endures not as an abstract idea, but as the beating heart of the modern quest for meaning. In every act of conscious striving, every repetition of ritual, every sacrifice that binds present suffering to future hope, the old pattern is lived again, and the gold of true meaning extracted anew from the crucible of necessity and the mountain of stone. Ultimately, what the Age of Capricorn bequeathed to us is not a lost catalogue of vanished ceremonies or extinct animals, but the durable grammar of symbolic transformation, a living gift inscribed in Psyche that transfigures every necessity into possibility. Meaning-making under such elemental pressure was no luxury. It was the foundational labour by which the soul, time and again, wrested freedom and significance from Saturn's cold decree. And the history of the unconscious itself testifies, where this labour continues, the human story continues, and where it ceases, spirit and culture both begin their slow decline to be reborn, if they are reborn at all, in more ancient and intractable forms. For in archetypal time, nothing is lost, it is only transformed forever. Section 6, Capricorn as Archetypal Pattern Former, Legacy and Modern Ramifications. With this sixth section, we approach the threshold that separates prehistory from the dawning outlines of historical time. But if we are to do justice to the deep structure of the collective psyche and to our obligations as its interpreters, we must recognise that the influence of the Age of Capricorn did not simply vanish with the retreat of the glaciers, like ice slicing down a valley in the spring. Rather, the dominant structures of Capricorn, the disciplines of memory, law and material mastery, formed in Jungian terms the scaffolding upon which subsequent psychological history would be constructed. The archetypal pattern-forming power of Capricorn is, in fact, the indispensable precondition for individuation at the level of the species. Just as the individual who matures by incorporating discipline is thereby able to undertake further transformations, psychotherapy's subsequent stages, or the adult's assumption of genuine spiritual responsibility, so too the societies that survived the glacial maxim entered a new psychic dispensation on the back of their hard-won mastery over disorder. The psychological capacities that Capricorn bequeathed, delayed gratification, trusted authority, systematic record-keeping, organised labour and the regularisation of cosmic time into calendar and myth, are not self-contained or self-sufficient, but preparatory. They mark both an end and a beginning. Nor did the work of Capricorn remain limited to the social plane. In the evolution of archetypes, every mastery introduces a shadow, every fixed order, a temptation toward stagnation, inflation, or idolatry. This is the ambiguity or dialectic of the archetypal process itself. Success may entail its own undoing, victory a blindness to new dangers, and the very genius of discipline may degrade into the brittle repetition of what was once creative. Saturn, after all, devoured his own children. The advances in planning, technology, and symbolic meaning that allowed human communities to outlast the LGM were also implicated in the subsequent patterns of repression, scapegoating, and even hubris that would threaten those same communities as their magical world gained incoherence and complexity. The process is precisely analogous to what the modern psyche must face in the middle years of adulthood or in the latter parts of psychotherapy. The very structures that once emancipated now constrain, and the very habits that achieved security now provoke anxiety by their monotony or excessive grip. This turning point describes the essential drama of the Capricornian legacy. Security, order, and the contained self are not the end goals of psychic evolution, but its essential preliminaries. Only by passing through Saturn's gate of necessity do we become free for the further work of spiritual development. To see this drama, one need only look to the broad sweep of human history, from the end of the Ice Age to the rise of the first civilizations. Everywhere the same pattern. Technological mastery and the domestication of matter provide surpluses that in time enable new articulations of power and meaning. City, priesthood, writing and law. That these surpluses also engender the repression of the unconscious is not accidental. As order hardens, it also partitions the psyche. The gods and ancestral powers, who once lived as immediate presences in the caves and trees, are slowly driven underground, becoming archetypal complexes in their own right, mourned and invoked in poetry and temple, but no longer directly available to the ordinary life of persons and communities. The most striking sign of this process is the institutionalization of memory. The invention of writing as an external storehouse of collective meaning marks both an unprecedented expansion of cultural power and a subtle contraction of individual memory, as dependence on the written sign weakens the faculty of recollection and conscious repetition. With stored knowledge, written, drawn, preserved in architecture and monument, comes the spread of the external law, the rise of systematized priesthoods, the routinization of ritual. Every one of these in its own way is a fulfillment of Capricorn, yet each also brings us closer to the shadow of sclerosis, the devouring aspect of Saturn, in which the life of meaning is gradually consumed by the forms meant to preserve it. The future of the archetype, then, is not a simple progression, but a spiral. And the direction it takes depends on how consciously the pattern is recognized and the shadow is carried. A society that raises up tradition but fails to teach innovation, that sacrifices the present entirely to the authority of the dead, that builds higher walls and ever stricter routines, such a society invites revolt, not only from without, but from within, from the neglected shadow archetypes, from the neglected instincts of the people, from the collective unconscious, and from the tragicomic gods who will not be silenced except by death. What is required, then, is a new work of adaptation, not a regression to the old gods, nor the worship of discipline for its own sake, but what the mystics called metanoia, a change of heart that carries forward the wisdom of Capricorn while relinquishing its tyranny. The synthesis needed at this psychic crossroads is precisely the task of the next evolutionary phase, an age, or succession of ages, wherein the fruits of reflection and self-mastery can be harvested for the sake of creative transformation. This task is as urgent in our own day as it has ever been. The shadow of Saturn persists in modern forms, in the totalitarian state, in the corporate conglomerate, in the technological infrastructure that, though built by our labour and intention, can become increasingly impersonal, abstract, and detached from the image of the soul. In therapy, Saturnian patterns show up as neuroses of control, compulsive routine, perfectionism, and the paralysis of self-doubt, all the marks of a society or individual who dares not move beyond the security of what worked once and who cowers in the face of the unknown. Yet, paradoxically, the same structures, if made conscious, can serve as the engine for renewal. The collective memory, once recognised for what it is, becomes the source of guidance, a storehouse of examples, warnings, and moral victories that remind us of our kinship with all who struggle under the law of necessity. The technology of planning, having secured survival, becomes a means of liberating time for higher pursuits, spiritual inquiry, artistic creation, the education of the psyche in the tools of self-healing and integration. In short, the Capricornian inheritance, once faced and integrated, builds the foundation of the next phase, a phase governed not by greed for security, but by the creative gamble of spirit. In the language of alchemy, the nigredo, or darkening, must give way to the albedo, the whitening, in which the distillation of judgment and discernment renders the psyche fit for the marriage of opposites. Just as the ultimate purposes of civilization cannot be to institutionalize security for its own sake, but must be the warranty of a freer, more conscious growth, so the ultimate work of the archetype is to press beyond the compulsions and anxieties it once enforced, toward the telos in which something wholly new is born. The gospel of Saturn is not that we remain slaves to law forever, but that by carrying the law inward, through experience, suffering, and understanding, we achieve grace. The practical meaning of this is plain for all to see. The Capricornian virtues, material mastery, prudent memory, the courageous acceptance of limitation, are needed more urgently today than ever before. The proliferation of information and technology, the fragmentation of authority, the atomization of communities, the rise of global threats to life and spirit, all these require a new effort of individuation, a renewal of the archetypal patterns that made modern civilization possible. But this effort cannot succeed if we deny the shadow, repress the instincts, or submit to routine for its own sake. Renewal demands the willingness to risk what has been achieved on the possibility of something more, something vouchsafed not by the dead letter, but by the living word, the anima mundi that whispers in every generation, "Come, let us make all things new." It may appear, at first glance, that turnover and innovation are dangerous, or that the shadow of chaos is something to be avoided at all costs. But the experience of therapy and of cultural development at large teaches us otherwise. Structures held too tightly will eventually shatter or dissolve, casting the psyche back into a state of regression from which only the most arduous work can extract a new beginning. Spirit, if denied, will not stand idle in the face of routine or oppression. It will return, often in the guise of neurosis, symptom, or delusion, to overthrow the false gods of security and open a clearing for the reappearance of possibility. We must therefore close this book, or this chapter of the collective psyche, by affirming that every true work of mastery, every great achievement in history, contains within itself the seeds of transformation. The age of Capricorn is at once the parent and the crucible of all that comes after. Its legacy is not a mere fossil buried in the unconscious, but a living pattern that continues to shape our every hope and every act. The law it prescribes is not an end, but a beginning, and the greatness of any age, then, now, or to come, is measured not by how closely it repeats the achievements of the past, but by how bravely it risks those achievements for the sake of a future whose gifts far exceed the necessary sufferings of the soul. In sum, the pattern-forming genius of Capricorn is for us both ancestor and provocateur. By honouring its legacy, bearing its burdens, and integrating its discipline, we render ourselves ready to awaken to the archetypes lying beyond. The initiatory journey of wild Sagittarius, the regenerative crucible of Scorpio, the balance of Libra's scales, and the pragmatic wisdom of Virgo's harvest. Each of these later archetypes will, in their season, supply what is lacking in any rigidified order, the necessary corrections, compensations, and new energies that drive the spiral of history and consciousness onward. But it is the stern matrix of Capricorn, wrought through cold suffering and preserved in stone and memory, that first makes this evolutionary ascent possible. Thus, we are entitled, if not obliged, to view the Capricornian pattern not as an outmoded fossil, but as the secret scaffolding that upholds the edifice of civilization and the soul alike. In every crisis or new beginning, be it of the individual seeking wholeness or the species approaching its next crossing, we will feel the stern, insistent voice of Saturn, reminding us that freedom without discipline is dissolution, and that true creativity arises from the tension of constraint overcome. It is this legacy, neither forgotten nor abolished by what follows, that must still be consciously retrieved, integrated, and offered to the next age, that the mountain of meaning might rise ever greater from the chaos, crowned at last with a wisdom that endures.